Imagine this. You decide to grow your own vegetables. You prepare a small area in your garden, plant your crops in long rows just like most gardening guides suggest, and wait for the harvest. At first, everything seems fine. The plants begin to grow, the leaves spread out, and your garden starts to look productive. But by the end of the season, something feels disappointing. The harvest is smaller than you expected. Large parts of the soil between the rows remain unused. Weeds start appearing in those empty spaces, and you realize that most of your garden area is actually producing very little food. This happens to many gardeners, especially those working with limited space. Traditional row gardening was originally designed for large farms where tractors need room to move between the crops. But in a small garden, those wide rows can waste a surprising amount of valuable space. And when space is limited, wasted space means wasted production. But there is a simple method that many intensive gardeners have used for decades to solve this problem. A method that allows you to grow more vegetables, improve soil health, and dramatically increase your harvest even in a small garden. It's called the raised bed method, and when used correctly, it can allow you to grow almost twice as much food in the same area. In this video, we'll break down exactly how this system works and how you can use it to turn even a small garden into a highly productive food-growing space. For generations, most gardening guides have recommended planting vegetables in long, straight rows. It's a method that works very well on large farms. When farmers are working with tractors, machines, and huge fields, those rows are necessary. They create space for equipment to move between crops and make large-scale farming possible. But in a home garden, that same system often creates a different problem. It wastes space. When you plant in rows, a large portion of your garden ends up being empty pathways between the plants. Those spaces are usually left bare so that you can walk through the garden, weed the soil, or reach the crops. But while those pathways are convenient, they are also unproductive. The soil in those areas isn't growing food. Instead, it often becomes a place where weeds grow, moisture evaporates, and valuable garden space goes unused. In many small gardens, as much as half of the available soil is actually part of these empty pathways rather than part of the productive growing area. And that means half the potential harvest is being lost before the season even begins. This is why many modern, intensive gardening systems started asking a simple question: what if we stopped growing vegetables in rows designed for machines and instead designed our gardens to maximize food production in every square meter? This is where raised beds completely change the way a garden works. Instead of planting vegetables in long rows separated by large walking spaces, the raised bed method concentrates the growing area into defined beds where every part of the soil is used for production. The idea is simple. You create permanent beds that are wide enough to reach from both sides, but narrow enough so that you never have to step on the soil. Because you never walk on the beds, the soil stays loose, aerated, and much healthier for plant roots. All the walking happens in the pathways between the beds, while the beds themselves are reserved entirely for growing crops. This simple change has several powerful effects. First, it prevents soil compaction, which allows roots to grow deeper and absorb nutrients more efficiently. Second, it improves drainage and soil structure, making it easier for plants to develop strong root systems. And third, it transforms almost the entire bed into productive growing space instead of leaving large empty areas between rows. In other words, more of your garden is actually producing food. But the real power of raised beds appears when you combine them with another key principle. Instead of planting vegetables in long rows, you begin planting them in dense blocks, and that's where the real increase in productivity begins. Once you stop planting in rows, the way you organize your plants begins to change. Instead of spacing vegetables in long lines with empty soil between them, you start planting them in small groups or blocks that fill the entire bed. This approach is often called block planting. The idea is simple. Plants are spaced evenly across the bed so that when they grow, their leaves begin to lightly touch each other and form a living canopy over the soil. That canopy creates several important advantages. First, it shades the soil. When the soil is covered by plant leaves, it loses less moisture to evaporation, which means the garden requires less watering. Second, the shade makes it harder for weeds to grow because weed seeds need sunlight to germinate. And third, the plants begin using the space much more efficiently. Instead of growing in isolated rows, they fill the entire bed with productive growth. The result is that every square foot of soil is actively producing food. This is one of the main reasons raised bed systems can produce much higher harvests than traditional row gardens. But for this method to work properly, the beds themselves need to be built with the right dimensions. And that's what we'll look at next. One of the reasons raised beds are so effective is that they are designed to make gardening easier and more efficient from the very beginning. The most important factor is the width of the bed. A raised bed should usually be about 1 to 1.2 meters wide, or roughly 3 to 4 feet. This size allows you to comfortably reach the center of the bed from either side without ever stepping on the soil. And avoiding stepping on the soil is critical. When soil is repeatedly walked on, it becomes compacted. Compacted soil restricts root growth, reduces air circulation in the soil, and makes it harder for plants to absorb water and nutrients. By keeping the beds permanent and only walking in the pathways between them, the soil inside the beds remains loose and healthy. The length of the bed is much more flexible. Some gardeners build beds 2 or 3 meters long, while others create much longer beds depending on the available space in their garden. The height of the bed can also vary. Even a shallow raised bed works well, but adding 15 to 30 centimeters of rich soil or compost can significantly improve growing conditions. In many gardens, raised beds are framed with wood, bricks, or other simple materials to keep the soil contained. But the most important part is not the frame itself. The most important part is the quality of the soil inside the bed, because healthy soil is what ultimately determines how productive your garden will be. One of the reasons raised beds are so effective is that they are designed to make gardening easier and more efficient from the very beginning. The most important factor is the width of the bed. A raised bed should usually be about 1 to 1.2 meters wide, or roughly 3 to 4 feet. This size allows you to comfortably reach the center of the bed from either side without ever stepping on the soil. And avoiding stepping on the soil is critical. When soil is repeatedly walked on, it becomes compacted. Compacted soil restricts root growth, reduces air circulation in the soil, and makes it harder for plants to absorb water and nutrients. By keeping the beds permanent and only walking in the pathways between them, the soil inside the beds remains loose and healthy. The length of the bed is much more flexible. Some gardeners build beds 2 or 3 meters long, while others create much longer beds, depending on the available space in their garden. The height of the bed can also vary. Even a shallow raised bed works well, but adding 15 to 30 centimeters of rich soil or compost can significantly improve growing conditions. In many gardens, raised beds are framed with wood, bricks, or other simple materials to keep the soil contained. But the most important part is not the frame itself. The most important part is the quality of the soil inside the bed, because healthy soil is what ultimately determines how productive your garden will be. While spacing and bed design are important, the real foundation of a productive raised bed garden is the soil. Healthy soil is what allows plants to grow quickly, develop strong roots, and produce abundant harvests. In raised beds, the goal is to create soil that is loose, rich in organic matter, and full of life. This usually means adding compost, well-decomposed organic material, or other natural amendments that improve soil structure. When soil contains plenty of organic matter, several good things happen. It holds moisture more effectively, which helps plants survive hot weather. It improves drainage so roots do not sit in water for too long. And most importantly, it feeds the millions of microorganisms that live in the soil. These tiny organisms break down organic material and release nutrients in forms that plants can easily absorb. Over time, this creates a living soil system that becomes more fertile every season. And because raised beds are never walked on, this rich soil structure remains loose and aerated, allowing roots to grow deeper and access more nutrients. In many cases, this is one of the biggest reasons raised beds produce such strong and healthy plants. But even with a well-built bed and good soil, there are still a few common mistakes that can reduce the productivity of a raised bed garden, and avoiding these mistakes can make a big difference in the harvest you get at the end of the season. Even though raised beds are simple and effective, a few common mistakes can prevent them from reaching their full potential. One of the most frequent problems is overcrowding plants. While block planting allows you to grow crops closer together than in traditional rows, plants still need enough space to receive sunlight and nutrients. If they are planted too densely, they begin to compete with each other, which can reduce growth and limit the size of the harvest. Another common mistake is poor soil preparation. Raised beds work best when the soil is rich in organic matter and well-structured. If the soil is too compact, too sandy, or lacking nutrients, the plants will struggle no matter how well the beds are designed. Watering can also become an issue. Because raised beds tend to drain more efficiently than flat ground, they can sometimes dry out faster, especially during hot weather. Consistent watering and good soil organic matter help maintain the right moisture balance. Finally, some gardeners make their beds too wide. If the bed is wider than you can comfortably reach from both sides, you may end up stepping on the soil while working in the garden. Over time, this compacts the soil and reduces many of the benefits that raised beds provide. Avoiding these mistakes helps ensure that your raised beds remain productive, healthy, and easy to manage throughout the growing season. When all of these elements come together, raised beds, block planting, healthy soil, and proper spacing, the results can be remarkable. Instead of a garden filled with wide rows and empty pathways, almost every part of the growing area becomes productive. More plants fit in the same space. The soil stays healthier because it is never compacted by foot traffic. Moisture is retained more effectively thanks to the natural canopy created by the plants. And weeds become less of a problem because the soil is shaded and protected. Over time, this creates a garden that is not only more productive, but also easier to maintain. Many gardeners who switch to raised beds are surprised by how much food they can produce in a relatively small area. Beds that once produced a modest harvest can begin yielding far more vegetables throughout the growing season. And perhaps most importantly, the system becomes more sustainable over time as the soil continues to improve year after year. With a thoughtful design and healthy soil, even a small garden can become a highly productive source of fresh food. Because when every square meter of soil is used efficiently, a garden doesn't need to be large to produce an abundant harvest.